Our scripture for today comes from Psalm 147. Praise Yahweh. It is wonderful to praise our God. Because God is beautiful, praise is fitting. Yahweh, Jerusalem's rebuilder, gathers the exiles of Israel, heals the brokenhearted, and mends their wounds. The one who numbers the stars and names each one is our sovereign, whose wisdom cannot be calculated. Yahweh lifts the oppressed off the ground and casts their oppressors to the ground. Sing to Yahweh with thanksgiving. Make melody to our God on the piano. God blankets the sky with clouds, pools rain for the earth, makes grass grow on the hills, provides food for animals, even young ravens when they cry. God takes delight neither in the strength of horses nor the prowess of your military. Rather, Yahweh takes pleasure in those who fear God, in those who long for God's covenant love. Exalt Yahweh, Jerusalem. Praise your God, Zion. For God alone strengthens your city gates and blesses the children living within them. God alone grants peace within your borders, fills you with the finest of wheat. God alone sends out God's word to the earth, a word which races swiftly. God pours snow like wool, scatters frost like ashes. God hurls down hail like breadcrumbs. Who can endure God's winter? But then God sends out word to melt it all, blows a hot breath, and snow melts into flowing water. God expresses God's word to Jacob, speaks statutes and ordinances to Israel. God has not offered such greatness to any other nation. They do not know God's ordinances. Praise Yahweh. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
For more than a decade, America has been circling around a basic question that I feel like we as a country, we as a people, we as even a church have not sufficiently faced and answered. What is it that makes a nation great? In my judgment, one of our political parties has largely avoided this question, allowing the other one to have a monologue about it. In my estimation, the mainline church, which is what Methodism is a part of, is largely allowed evangelicals to talk about this and have this conversation. And we have not, in my estimation, provided an alternative narrative to those who define national greatness in certain ways. And so in the midst of that lingering question, in has stepped our president. And he said, I will define for you what national greatness looks like. I alone can in fact tell you what this means. And the thing is, he didn't and hasn't just offered political answers. If it were merely a matter of disagreeing politics, I might not even bring this up in a sermon, but what he and his party have done has actually baptized their ideas of national greatness in Bible verses. They've baptized their idea of America's greatness in Christian-sounding slogans. Even when the Pope disagrees with them, they still say them. So over the last 12 years, this is what I have heard from Make America Great Again, people make America great again, Christians. And I want you to know that I worked really hard, because I think if you've listened to me week after week, you know that I'm going to have fundamental disagreements with this, right? But I worked really hard on this section of the sermon to make sure that I faithfully represent the Make America Great Again movement. If you're a Make America Great Again person, I want you to hear the next few things I have to say, and I want you to be like, yes, he faithfully represented what I think American greatness is. The Make America Great Again movement has said that what makes a nation great is when it's strong, when it's secure, and when it is able to protect itself without relying on others. The Make America Great Again ideology has said that a nation is great when it has a shared cohesive identity, common values, rather than being divided by competing loyalties. The Make America Great Again political platform has said that a nation is great when it prioritizes order, stability, and winning. The Make America Great Again slogan and those who use it have said that a nation is great when it honors its past and refuses to live in guilt or shame about its failures. A nation is great when people are valued for their productivity. Threats to the nation's greatness are clearly named. And faith reinforces national confidence in the nation, its institutions, and its leaders. Now, my concern today is not merely to state my disagreement. That would be something you would have already gathered over the last 10 years. My concern is for those of us who are not MAGA Americans, and for those of us who are not MAGA Christians, to actually be able to take up the question of what makes a nation great and to articulate an alternative. To not merely look at Donald Trump and say, nuh-uh, but to actually posit an alternative answer to the question, what makes a nation great? It's not enough merely to critique slogans. We must articulate an alternative vision, and I think Psalm 147 helps us do just that. Psalm 147 was written about 100 to 150 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the burning and destruction of the temple, and the Babylonians taking tens of thousands of Jews and dispersing them away from their own homeland. We call it disappearing them throughout the Babylonian Empire. Psalm 147 is written 150 years after those events, looking at the worst time in Israel's history. But they're looking at it from a time frame where Ezra has led the people back into the promised land, where the walls of the city of Jerusalem have been rebuilt, where the nation is beginning to come back together, and God has gathered together those who have been scattered for 150 years. And so it is a time of excitement, a time where they get to ask the question, after our devastation, we get to rebuild who we are. Who do we want to be? That's the question Psalm 147 is addressing. What does it mean for a nation to be great? And verse 2 names how Israel understood this moment. The return to Jerusalem did not come about because of clever political maneuvering. It did not come about because of even military strength. Those people who were scattered in exile had no military strength, had no centralized institution. Theirs was utterly hopeless and helpless. And so in the mind of the psalmist, 150 years later, to look at this community of scattered people who had been disappeared, to see them come back together in this nation and to form a cohesive identity is nothing less than a gift of God. Verse 2 will tell us that from the very beginning, to speak about national greatness is to give God the first verbs. That verbal emphasis that God defines greatness, that God, in fact, gifts greatness, is the emphasis through the rest of this psalm. And so when our national leaders tell us that greatness is tied to military strength and self-reliance, Psalm 147 and the Psalms generally reject that logic. The Psalms repeatedly contrast military prowess with trust in God. Every nation, it's not unique to ours. Every nation has always believed that greatness must be violently secured. But what made Israel unique is that they were in a rare historical moment where they realized we don't have the military prowess to do anything, and yet God is making something great out of us. God, the psalmist says, does not delight in war machines, which at the time the apex of war machines were horses. God doesn't delight in war machines or how many you have. God is not impressed by the speed of your military or your military posture. The psalm says that those are not the things that God deems great. In biblical imagination, self-reliance and military power do not make a nation great. Our current political leaders tell us that a nation is great when it shares a common identity and common values rather than being fragmented by identities and different languages and different stories. But I find it so interesting that Psalm 147 doesn't even touch national cohesion. They know that the people that God is gathering back together have had for the last 150 years all kinds of different cultural, linguistic experiences. Israel, you can't really know this unless you just are nerdy and you read this kind of stuff. The way the exile in Babylon shaped Israel's national identity is deeply profound. They were not the same people coming back as they were before they left. They were profoundly shaped by encountering Babylonian religion, Persian religion, Greek religion. They were forced to renegotiate who they thought they were. Do you know why we have ancient texts of the Psalms that were written in Greek? Because Greek became the primary language of a lot of the Jews. This is why Paul's letters are in Greek. Paul had never lived in the Promised Land. The majority of Jewish people after the Babylonian exile never again returned to the Promised Land. And those who did were profoundly shaped and changed by their experience not living in the land. They did not see national cohesion in terms of a shared language and a shared identity as the thing that holds them together. What Psalm 147 says is that national greatness begins with God gathering the deported, healing the brokenhearted, binding wounds. We, and this is Democrat and Republican problem, We begin our stories of national greatness with our victory, with our power, with our dominance over the world. Psalm 147 begins the narrative of national greatness with hurting people. With people who have been ripped from their homes and disappeared into the world. With the people who know 150 years of having their children lynched and killed. Yahweh begins to explain national greatness through those who know wounds. The psalmist presses this image further. You know the text in Psalm 147 that says that God not only counted the stars, but named them? Every Jewish hearer reciting Psalm 147 at worship would have immediately heard echoes of Genesis chapter 15 in Psalm 147. In Genesis chapter 15, God is talking to Abraham, and Abraham is saying, look, God, you said that I was going to have children and land. You were going to make a great nation out of me. And now decades have passed, and you've done nothing. And God appears to Abraham in a dream, and God says to Abraham, I know you're getting old, and I know your wife is well past menopause, and I know that you don't think it is possible, but I'm the God who gets the first verbs. And I'm telling you that you are going to have so many children that they will rival the number of stars in the sky. Psalm 147 is echoing that. Every listener would have heard the Abraham story and they said, you know what? Abraham, every time he tried to take the first verbs from God, and every time he tried to initiate the solving of his problem, he messed it up. Every time he tried to make a great nation of himself, he messed it up. He went to what is equivalent to a sex slave. And he impregnated her, and when she had his first ever son, he said, this must be how God is bringing this about. And God said, you don't get the first verbs. When you get the first verbs, that's when you end up with things like sex slaves. That's when you end up with dehumanizing people and treating them as mere wombs. That's not greatness. God is the initiator of greatness. God gets the first verbs. But here's the thing. The God who created the stars and the God who counts the stars also knows their names. This is to me where Psalm 147 decimates nationalist idolatries. When greatness depends on winning, people become statistics. When prosperity is connected to the GDP, people become statistics. Security, national security becomes about border numbers. War becomes about body counts. And human lives are flattened to statistics. But Psalm 147 insists that God does not relate to people as numbers. God knows names. And I'm going to tell you right now, Psalm 147 could have been written by a Wesleyan theologian, a Methodist. Because this is exactly what John Wesley said. John Wesley, in his sermon on the poor, he said this. He said, the reason so few of us don't care about the poor is because we so seldom visit them and know their names. They're a statistic to us. They're a frustration to us. They're an annoyance to us. There's something that's getting in our way. There's something that we would rather not see, but we have to see. There's something that we would rather not hear, but we have to hear. And it is easier for us to deal with the grief of suffering in the richest nation in the world. It is easier for us to deal with that by turning it into statistics and separating it from our emotions, because statistics deal with the mental, rational, logical side of our brain. And what God is saying is that names make us feel something. Wesley said the reason why we so don't care about the poor is because we so seldom visit them and we don't know their names. Psalm 147 insists that God does not relate to people as numbers. God knows names. God knows the names of the hungry. God knows the names of every person who has been disappeared by ice. God knows the names of the dead who the world only tallies as collateral damage of yet another bomb dropped. God knows the names of every child. Have you seen this thing? I have never seen this show. Do you know this person, Miss Rachel? She does the children's programming, I think, on YouTube. And she's gotten massively, like, kids already loved her because she talks to them about, like, how do we feel our feelings and stuff like that. And she talked about how Israel is indiscriminately killing Palestinian children. And so what she started doing was she started having videos of Palestinian children where she was interacting with them. And our national leaders started talking about her and criticizing her as some kind of like anti-Semite or something because she said all children matter because all children have names. I'm telling you, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, but I'm telling you right now, if your politics excuses at all the death of children, then you are worshiping some other God than the one revealed in Jesus Christ. My God knows the names of dead children. What makes a nation great is that we know names of the people who suffer on behalf of our systems. Do you see, I understand. I understand that we live in an imperfect world. I understand that our systems are imperfect. I understand that there's no utopia on earth, that that's just a pipe dream. I understand that any system we set up, no matter the goals of our benevolence, are always going to fail in some sense because we are human, right? I can appreciate that and be realistic about that. However, what makes a nation great is that when people slip through the cracks of our institutions, we know their names and we care when they slip through the cracks. Instead, it seems like that we have become comfortable just with the fact that people slip through the cracks and they've become statistics to us instead of human beings. And our media does that to us. So that could be left-wing media too. They're all owned by the same 5 people. Naming matters. Our national leaders tell us that a nation is great when it takes pride in its history and refuses to live in guilt or shame. You hear this claim in people who say things like our vice president really recently did when he said, you no longer have to apologize for being white. Look, man, I'm a 45-year-old white man. I ain't never had to apologize for being white. And I'm telling you that as a person who, I did my PhD in black rhetoric. I have read more black philosophy and theology and academic works, woke stuff, than almost any other white dude. I'm telling you. And no one has ever asked me to apologize for being white because it's not a thing. What people are asking is that we acknowledge the benefits we have for being white and how those benefits are not extended toward everyone. No one has ever saw a white dude driving down the road in a minivan and thought, I bet he's here illegally. Am I right? That's a privilege I have that not everybody else has. I'm not going to apologize for that privilege. I'm not asking you to apologize for that privilege. I'm asking you to acknowledge that it's not something everyone has. When I say, when our leaders say things like, well, now you don't have to apologize any longer for being white, who's the victim in that narrative? Me, right? I get to now have all kinds of resentment because people are keeping me down. But it's all made up. It's all made up. It's made up so that I am therefore capable of focusing on myself, seeing myself as the victim, and I don't have to see how other people don't experience life the same way I do. No one is asking us to apologize for being white. We're asking us to see not everybody gets the benefits of it. And to look at our institutions and name where they're failing so that we can bring more and more people into the blessings that is the greatness of this country. Therefore, we need to name names. We don't get to go to the Smithsonian and say, I walked through the Smithsonian and I just didn't feel good about their slavery wing. That didn't make me feel good as a white guy, so let's go ahead and do away with all that and change that narrative so that it makes white people look better. No, that's a decision to not name the problem. When God says that God names the stars, everyone would have heard God is naming the children of Abraham. They have names even in their suffering. What we do is, I'm going to tell you right now, you want to know if I could get the church in America to do this for the next 30 years of my life until I'm dead and gone, here's what it would be. Name the truth. Whether it's my political ideology or not, just name it. This is where we have failed as a people. This is where I have failed as an individual. Because the only step forward to actual greatness is beginning by naming where we have failed to be great. And we have failed to be great. We have. Jon Stewart said, like 7 years ago, he was like, here's the question that I wish the media would ask MAGA. When was America great? Because whatever time period that you name, it can only be a time period that was great for white men. White straight men in particular. Everybody else who doesn't qualify on that at some various time in American history has not got to participate in that greatness. And Jon Stewart wanted us to name it so that we could stop playing the rhetorical games. We must name our history. We must use names like Emmett Till. We must use names like Tyree Nichols. Memphis must name those names. Freedom is not having to admit that anything was wrong to begin with. Never mind, let me start that over. Psalm 147 does not want us to just pretend like everything has always been bad. But it does want us to be honest. Psalm 147 is not going to allow us to participate and propagate propagandist history. God is not interested in propagandizing you. Do you ever notice how the Old Testament, when it looks back on the golden age of Israel, who was king? David, right? That's the golden age. The majority of the David narrative is how this dude was messed up. Incredibly messed up. A rapist. A murderer. An abuser of power. The Old Testament refuses to avoid naming those things about its greatest king. I feel like that sets a precedent for us. We got politicians and billionaires spent time on this dude's island. We can name that. We should name that. The Bible gives us the precedent for naming things that are uncomfortable. That's what it means for a nation to be great. A great nation doesn't avoid the wounds of its history, it names them. God will not rebuild the national greatness on top of denial. Restoration requires truth-telling. Healing requires honesty. And you cannot build greatness on the back of lies. Nor can you build a nation on the backs of people reduced to machines and productivity. Our political leaders tell us that a nation is great when people are valued for what they contribute, when they produce things. That is what makes them worthy of basic human dignity and life. And it blows my mind that Christians get on board with that without question. Because when you go back to the Garden of Eden story, where God instituted work as a part of what it means to be human, that work was only given to the human race after the divine image was bestowed on the human race, after the breath of life was given to the human race. Human dignity in the garden precedes work. It does. People don't deserve to feed their kids because they produced enough at work. They deserve to feed their kids and have a place to live because they're created in the image of God. End of discussion. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, if you all fired me, please don't. If you did, I'm going to find ways to work. Because God put me on this earth to do things for the betterment of humanity and to better my community and to build my relationships and to make sure that other people are flourishing, including my community. Getting a paycheck is not what gives me dignity. That's not even the work God institutes in the garden. The dignity is already there, and I work out of my sense of dignity, not for my sense of dignity. Does that make sense? I'm going to tell, how are you going to tell my mother was a single mom. She was a waitress entire growing up. She was a waitress or she worked at a convenience store. She had 4 children. My dad was gone. And I remember as a child feeling shame because I got free lunch at school. That somehow even the children of a woman who is working full time feel the shame of not having dignity because she doesn't make enough money. Now, can you see generation after generation? I was lucky enough to escape that. And a lot of that was I worked hard, but a lot of that was I made connections with people who had resources who helped me. I couldn't have done it on my own. But what I want you to understand is, can you imagine generation after generation after generation of that? You can imagine why people would be like, why would I go to work for minimum wage when I can't even feed my own children based on that? And then I get to the end of every month and I have to pay my bills, and there's no dignity because I know the lines aren't going to match up. I know I'm always going to be in the red. Why would I keep doing this to myself? Why? And you can imagine generation after generation of that, despair sets in and helplessness sets in. And it's because we live in a society that says national and individual greatness is determined by what you work and how much you produce and how much money you make, instead of dignity being a given before you work. You imagine what it's like to be a child going to school and you're hungry? You think you're going to be productive and learn things? No. Dignity has to precede productivity. That is what makes a nation great. Psalm 147 centers on the brokenhearted, the deported, and the hungry because they matter to how greatness is measured. God is not the chaplain of the powerful. God is the one who lifts the lowly and calls human pretension into question. Here is the inconvenient truth that Psalm 147 sticks into all of our politics. No nation makes itself great. Greatness is a gift. And Israel had the choice to respond by rejecting God-given greatness or by working with it to spread that greatness to the most vulnerable members of its community. To me, that same question now faces this country and this church. Not whether America will ever be great, not whether America ever was great, but whether we, the church, will trust the God who insists on getting the first verbs. Because when humans seize the first verbs, that's when other people's dignity is reduced. That's when we become Pharaoh in Egypt or Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, where other people are reduced to what they do for me. But when we recognize that the first verbs belong to God, greatness looks like healing. Greatness looks like hospitality to those we don't have to welcome. Greatness looks like hearts of compassion. Only that kind of nation can be eternally called great. Which is why every week, when we come to this table, we see greatness embodied. Not in declarations of war or weapons of destruction or large piles of money and power. We see greatness embodied in the broken body and shed blood of a crucified man who God looked at and said, that is what greatness looks like. And it is wild to me that the church has lost that message.